The most successful coaches never stop learning. They are committed to their personal growth and making themselves better. I'm Colby Donovan, and welcome to the Coaching Coaches Podcast. I'll speak with the world's most respected coaches, best-selling authors, and top business leaders to give you insight into their philosophies, lessons, and mindsets for you to apply to your own life. Head on over to coachingcoaches.co, where you can subscribe to this podcast and join some of the top coaches around the country who also enjoy our regular newsletter. My guest today is Annie Duke, who was previously one of the best poker players in the world and is now a renowned public speaker and best-selling author. If anyone has the perfect background to discuss decision-making, it's Annie. Our conversation today focuses on her two books, Thinking in Bets and How to Decide. We discuss both causes of bad decisions and ways to make better ones. She explains the issue with analyzing decisions based on outcome and uses real decisions made by Pete Carroll, Nick Saban, and Bill Belichick as examples. We also discuss best practices for group decision-making, and she does so from the standpoint of a coaching staff or front office when scouting or drafting a player. Please enjoy the episode. Annie, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
So before we dive into all things decision-making, I think your background is really unique. So do you mind going from your time at UPenn to a bar in Montana playing poker and how that all turned out?
Oh my gosh, I love that you say that. I have to say, I think you're the first person who mentioned specifically the bar in Montana, which was called the Crystal Lounge, which I think is so apropos for what you would imagine it was. So I'll give more detail than usual about that bar. So I started off my life on a pretty set trajectory. I went to college and then I went to graduate school and I was doing Ph.D. work in cognitive science at the University of Pennsylvania. I was there for 5 years. I was on a National Science Foundation fellowship and I was studying learning. So I was in cognitive psychology, which is just basically when you think about sort of what is that covering, it's how do we kind of build models of the world, right? So the world exists separate and apart from us. We interact with it, and then our brains sort of figure out how to make sense of that world. And that's kind of what I was studying. So you can see how like learning would be involved in that. So you're trying to learn things about the world, but also people were doing, in that we're thinking about like color perception or taste, or even, just sort of how you navigate through the world or how you figure out that something is farther away from you than closer to you. I mean, it encompasses a lot of stuff. And then it was, at the time, this is when, cognitive science in general, which is really interdisciplinary, was starting to be a burgeoning field. So you were talking to computer scientists and neurologists and really trying to understand kind of holistically how you're making sense of your environment. How you're thinking about things, how are you learning about things. So that's what I was doing for those 5 years. So as one does after one spends 5 years working on their PhD, I became a professional poker player, which particularly was weird then, I have to say, because now I think people are so used to it's been 18 years or so, I think, since poker was first on television. And so we just sort of think about it as like golf. It's always been on TV for you to watch. And obviously there was sort of the explosion of internet poker that also really popularized it. But before 2002, people weren't watching poker on TV. So, this was in the 90s. So it was particularly strange. I think that when I started doing it, people had wondered if I was also like dealing drugs, like kind of in the, what, why are you gambling? You might as well be playing roulette, trying to make a living at that, which would be impossible. And clearly you need to go to Gamblers Anonymous. So anyway, how I kind of ended up playing poker was basically I just needed to take a year off from graduate school. And it was just due to a health issue that I was having. And, I was planning to go back and become a professor. So I didn't want to do something that was going to be like a new career. I wanted to do something where I could set my own hours because I didn't know if I was going to feel well from day to day. And, so I was in Montana at the time when I was trying to recuperate, which is where my ex-husband's family was from. And so we were married at the time and staying there. And it just turns out that in Montana, there were some legal poker games. And so I picked it up as a way to kind of make money in the meantime until I was maybe going to go back becoming a professor. And as you said, it was in a bar. So it was in downtown Montana at a place called the Crystal Lounge. And you would go in, and this was actually the place where all the sex workers congregated.
Nice.
So when you went into the top floor, there was usually, like, if it was the weekends, there was one guy playing a guitar, like doing country music covers, and then there were like the sex workers at the bar. And then there was, downtown Billings at the time. I think it's probably been revitalized, but it was a little Skid Row-ish, I have to say.
Yeah, I don't see it as like New York, Chicago.
Yeah, it's kind of like back in the day, there were places in New York that now are quite gentrified, like Hell's Kitchen, that, there's a reason why it was called Hell's Kitchen. So that was kind of like what this was. And then, like, along the wall, there were like video poker machines that you could, that were like you put $5 in or whatever. So that's not obviously, but if you sort of circled around all of that and you navigated your way through that, there was a stairway, a little tiny narrow stairway in the back, and you would go down into it. And down in the basement, there were two poker tables set up. And one was a $3, $6 table to give people a sense of scale. The most that you would really be thinking about risking in a $3, $6 would be like $200 maybe.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And then there was a $10 and $20 table. That was like the big time. And this was limit poker. And so in that, like $600 to $800 maybe is what you'd be willing to use. So yeah, and you'd go down there and you were immediately, like, you couldn't see anything because every single person smoked. It was like, you were just like covered in smoke the minute that you came down. There were no women. So I was like in my 20s, like, skipping on down into the basement at the Crystal Lounge to go play poker, in the meantime, waiting to go become a college professor.
And then that kicks off a long poker career for you.
As it turned out, the meantime turned into a really long time. And within a couple of years, I had moved out of that bar in Billings and was on my way to Las Vegas to play professional poker. So, that's just, I guess, the normal path that people take.
Typical UPenn grad.
Yeah.
So, in your first book, Thinking in Bets, you talk about a famous example of people focusing on outcome instead of the process, especially afterwards. And it's a example that you call resulting, and of Pete Carroll in the Super Bowl with the Seahawks when he had Russell Wilson throw it on the 1-yard line and he was intercepted. So can you talk about that situation and your thought process about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, and this is such an important concept that I actually open how to decide with this concept as well, taking it sort of deeper and farther. Because I think that if I think about, what's the single biggest thing that really trips up our ability to learn from experience, it's resulting, which is basically this. In order to improve decision making and to think about our decisions, what do we have but the experience of our lives, right? Like, we make decisions and we sort of see how they turn out, and then we take lessons from that and we alter our decisions going forward, and hopefully we're getting better at it. But the problem with resulting is that when we actually know what the outcome is, good or bad, it casts a pretty dark and deep shadow over our ability to sort of look back into what the quality of the decision was. So this Pete Carroll example is such a good example of this. I'm sure that all of your listeners are aware of what happened to Pete Carroll. So there was 26 seconds left in the Super Bowl. This was in 2015, playing the dreaded Patriots. And the Seahawks are on the 1-yard line. It's fourth down with 26 seconds left. Sorry, it's not fourth down. It's the fourth quarter with 26 seconds left, and it's second down. So obviously, with it being second down on the 1-yard line, they were behind by 4. They have 3 tries to try to score a touchdown: second down, third down, and fourth down. So that's the maximum number of attempts that they're going to get. The problem, of course, is they only have 26 seconds left, and the Seahawks only have 1 timeout. So it's going to be a little, they have a little bit of a clock problem here, obviously. Now, at the time, Marshawn Lynch was, one of the premier running backs, obviously, in the NFL, playing for the Seahawks, and everybody had a particular expectation. And the expectation was that Pete Carroll was going to call for Russell Wilson to hand that ball off to Marshawn Lynch. Marshawn Lynch was, obviously going to advance the ball the 1 yard, the 1 yard that he needed to and score a touchdown. And then the Patriots were going to lose. But that's actually not what Pete Carroll decided to do. Instead, he called for a pass play. He had Russell Wilson pass to the corner of the end zone, and it was intercepted by Malcolm Butler. So we know what happened. And the headlines were just like brutal. Some of them one of them called him an idiot. Most of them said it was the worst play call in Super Bowl history. USA Today actually said it was the worst play call in all of NFL history. It's pretty shocking. I mean, that's a pretty big claim. And what's interesting about this is that when you actually read these articles, you don't really see a lot about the decision making, right? You hear a lot about the outcome. It was a terrible outcome. And you kind of know what the expected play was, which was to hand it off to Marshawn Lynch. But nobody's really backing it up. Why do you think that was a bad outcome? So, we can start here to sort of see what the problem is. So let's just start to unpack it a little bit. And I'm just going to ask you to go through the thought experiment with me. So let's imagine that Pete Carroll doesn't hand it off to Marshawn Lynch and instead has Russell Wilson throw the ball to the end zone, unexpected to be sure, and it's caught for the game-winning touchdown.
He's a genius because he goes against the grain, and it worked.
Oh, that's weird. So nobody's saying it was the worst call in NFL history now?
I don't think the USA Today is saying that.
But isn't the decision the same either way? Like when you think about what, at the time that Pete Carroll is making his decision, doesn't matter what the decision's the same, whether it ultimately ends up being intercepted or ultimately ends up being a touchdown, or frankly, whether it ultimately ends up being an incomplete pass. No matter what, all three of those things are possibilities at the time that Pete Carroll makes the decision. But what you can see is that when we actually know it got intercepted, we have a very different view of the quality of that decision than when we know it was the game-winning touchdown. But that shouldn't be the case, not in the short run anyway. So here's where we have this problem. So we can actually kind of just walk through what the decision is like super fast to see why this really messes us up. Because all of America certainly thinks this was a terrible decision and think that this is a decision that shouldn't be repeated. But the question is, what if it was a really good decision? Haven't we taken the wrong lesson from it? So let's just try to figure out whether it was a good decision or not. I mean, I think it's worth it. So I think the single most important thing to know in terms of whether that was a good decision is, what's the probability the ball gets intercepted? Because I think we can agree it's a really different situation if the ball is going to get intercepted 40% of the time than if the ball is going to get intercepted 8% of the time. So I'll just ask you the question, do you have any idea how, in that particular situation, what the sort of rate of interception is?
I want to say you talked about it and think it in bets, and I want to say it's like 1%.
Yeah, so at the lower end, it's around 1%. At the upper end, and it just depends on how you run the data, right?
Yeah.
The upper end, it's 2%. You can get it all the way up to 2%.
Yeah.
Okay, so the question is, what are you buying for that 2% chance of an interception? So let's just first of all think about that. And the answer is you're buying an extra down. So if you hand it off to Marshawn Lynch and he fails to score, the clock runs and you have to call a timeout. And then if you hand it off to Marshawn Lynch again, that's the end of the game. Because if he doesn't score, you have no clock left. But if you choose to pass on either first or second down, and I guess in this case, second or third down, I'm completely neutral which one you happen to pass on. But we know that when that ball is incomplete, the clock stops on its own. So Pete Carroll doesn't have to use the timeout in order to get the clock to stop. And that's going to allow him to get 3 plays off instead of 2. So if he could do it on first down, or he could on the first down that he has, second down, or he could do it on third down. I don't care which one, but he's got to do it on one of the first 2 attempts. And he happened to choose to do it on the first attempt. That's aside from comparing it to what's the probability that they score there. versus what's the probability they score if they hand it off to Marshawn Lynch. And we haven't even gotten into that, and it's already looking like a pretty good decision, because I don't know about you, but when I'm playing Belichick, I would like to have 3 downs rather than 2. I don't know. I just like 3 tries to get past the Patriots in 2015, certainly, rather than 2. Okay. So, but then we can also look at what happens if you hand it off to Marshawn Lynch. And that's an interesting, because in the red zone, when we know that the defense, everything's compressed and the field is compressed, Marshawn Lynch actually scores there about 20% of the time. But the rate of a touchdown in that situation runs, I believe, just like nobody you can all fact check me on this, because I think it's around 40%, like ish. So
yeah.
My estimate there is around 40%. So just on its own, it looks like you score more there, right? Like just on its own. But notice, like, you may not agree, even after I go through all of that it was an amazing decision. You may still think it would have been better to hand it off to Marshawn Lynch for whatever reason. Fine. But certainly when you go through all that, you realize it's not the worst decision in Super Bowl history. Neither, by the way, is it the best decision in Super Bowl history, which I think is what USA Today would have said had the ball been caught for a touchdown.
And that distinction, I think, is so important and interesting, too, because you have a similar situation, I think, about Alabama in the national championship game against Georgia a few years ago, and Saban's got a Heisman-winning quarterback who's won a national championship, I think, at that point, and they're down, 20, 30 at halftime, and he pulls that guy and throws into I'm not even going to try his last name, and he brings them back to a win. And it's Nick Saban is just this genius, brilliant football mind. But if it didn't work, it would have been, how is Saban? Yeah, what is he doing going with a backup quarterback?
The World Baseball, like the World Series a few years ago, where who was it? Someone was really far ahead, and then they pulled the pitcher.
That's another situation where I feel like the coach is damned if he does, damned if he doesn't,
exactly,
regarding the outcome in the media and the perception of it.
And I mean, they were really far ahead, and there was no reason. I mean, obviously what happened was really low probability that they actually ended up losing that game. I thought that was interesting, because actually Trump chimed in on that and said it was a really horrible decision. But you run the math, and they were very far ahead. I can't remember how far ahead they were, but it was a lot.
Yeah.
And like, you need to, you might need that pitcher for another game, right? So you want to pull him out, let them rest, let him rest his arm. So when we see this all the time, Doug Peterson with I'm a Eagles fan, so I was certainly happy about this play, but the Philly special, was that the most genius thing that ever happened? Well, you could, if it fails, everybody's gonna be like, what an idiot. Why didn't he go for the field goal? Or they would have said, that was dumb. Nick Foles isn't a receiver. Why would you send him into the end zone to catch a ball? Like, you can see how these things are getting pulled around. And this is happening to us all the time. It actually happened in the 2016 election when Hillary Clinton loses Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And everybody just completely agrees that her campaign strategy was idiotic, that she didn't campaign in those 3 states. But here's the weird thing about that. If it was a terrible decision, and you're talking about something like a national presidential campaign, where every single data scientist and political observer and pundit and strategist and journalist is writing pieces and commenting in real time about the strategies. We can see this now with Trump and Biden, right? Everybody's got something to say about Biden's strategy and Trump's strategy and so on and so forth. This is really crowdsourced. If it was so stupid for her not to campaign in those 3 states, there would be a record of it, because people would have been writing pieces about it at the time. And if you search it, what you'll see is that the first piece appears on November 9th of 2016. What a weird date. The election was on the 8th. But everybody thinks that she made terrible decisions. Okay, well then how come nobody knew about it? So this is really happening, whether it's politics or sports or your own personal life. You're doing this all the time. And it's a really problematic for making good decisions, because we end up essentially doing the equivalent of saying, I drove home drunk and I got home safely, so that was a good decision. Let me do that one again. And then here's the really interesting thing about that particular example, which I'd love to take in a little bit of a different direction. So I'd love to do like a slightly different thought experiment with you to really see how resulting really creates problems for decision-making and what we learn and how we make decisions. So if you'll bear with me, I'd love to do this other thought experiment. Okay, so I want you to imagine something. Imagine that Pete Carroll hands the ball off to Marshawn Lynch. It's what everybody expects, right? Okay. So he hands the ball off to Marshawn Lynch, and Marshawn Lynch doesn't score. That's second down. Pete Carroll calls a timeout, and now he hands the ball to Marshawn Lynch again. It's what everybody expects, right? Okay. Marshawn Lynch fails to score, clock runs out, Patriots win. What do you think the headlines look like the next day?
Patriots win.
Patriots win. So do you think probably, I see my intuition, and I could be wrong here, but I think my intuition is that it's, Patriots, win their fifth Super Bowl. Belichick, has created a dynasty. Da da da. I don't think that anybody is saying what a stupid, ridiculous decision Pete Carroll made. I don't sense that that's going to happen. I think it's more just about the Patriots are just too good, and not so much about like Pete Carroll's decision making there. So I think that's kind of interesting. So we can see, because this ends up happening kind of in sports all the time. And we can think about this in terms of sort of what's happened with like fourth down decisions or pulling the goalie in either soccer or hockey, as an example. We can see now like this all gets interrelated, and it's kind of like the really bad hidden effects of resulting, which is that resulting is unevenly applied. When people do something where we don't quite understand already whether the decision is good or not. In other words, we just don't have a lot of knowledge about the quality of the decision. We haven't agreed upon it yet. Now, when you have a result, we take a lot from it. So that would mean when you're doing something that's unusual, that maybe the fans don't understand, where you're doing something innovative. And that's what Pete Carroll did when he called the pass play. It was super unexpected. And we can see what happens. When people don't really quite understand the decision, there isn't a lot of consensus around it. It's not something the fans understand. It's not something that the pundits, like the commentators understand, all the Monday morning quarterbacks. When it works out, you're a genius. Doug Peterson is a genius, right? When it doesn't work out, you're an idiot, right? That's the Pete Carroll case. But when you do something that is pretty settled, like handing the ball off to Marshawn Lynch, people kind of understand this decision and they've already sort of agreed to it. Now, when you fail, it's like, bad luck. I mean, what could you do? It's Belichick, right? And when you succeed, it's like, good job, right? And you can see that, like if Marshawn Lynch scores, nobody's talking 5 years ago about that particular decision, right? But we are talking about it because he did something different. Okay, so now let's think about the interaction of those two things, right? Whenever you do something that's unusual, you're risking idiot. And most people would prefer to risk bad luck than idiot. If I hand it off to Marshawn Lynch, my risk is that people say I kind of had some bad luck. If I choose a pass play, even if it's the better decision, and it doesn't work out, I'm risking idiot. And 5 years later, people are still talking about what an idiot I was. People don't want to risk that because that's career risk. That's the fans getting on you. So what that means is that even when something increases your win probability, you may not do it if it's not really understood by the fans. I'll give you like a super simple example to ground this. We all know what the traffic laws are. So we know what good driving is. We know what the rules are. So if I go through a green light and get in an accident, nobody thinks I made a bad decision because we already understand the decision. That's like handing the ball off to Marshawn Lynch. It's only when I do something that sort of like people don't understand, that sort of breaks the rules, that I'm going to get in trouble. And now we can circle back to fourth down decisions in the NFL. We can circle back now to why aren't people pulling the goalie in hockey? Well, because the fans don't understand the decision. Your GM may not understand the decision. The owner might not understand the decision. Your players might not understand the decision. And you have a lot of risk. Even if it really drastically increases your win probability, you have a lot of risk when you make those kinds of decisions of having people go after you. And so what happens is that you pull back and you go to the more conservative choice until it becomes kind of more status quo, right? Until someone comes along like Belichick and starts making those kinds of decisions and sort of makes it okay. And here's the interesting thing about Belichick. This is what I think is really interesting. When you look at the early part of his career, he wasn't doing those things on fourth down, right? He's really famous for going for it on fourth down in places where people didn't necessarily understand. Guess what? The first few years of his NFL career, he wasn't doing that. It wasn't until he was already, he had a ring where people were, his job wasn't at risk anymore, where he felt like he had the freedom to fail or the freedom to say, well, if Belichick did it, it must have been great, that he started to make those fourth down calls. Even then, he still got criticized because we all remember the one, right? But you can see he had a lot of protection, right? His career wasn't at risk late, sort of in the mid part of his career. But in the early part of his career, when it was at risk, he wasn't necessarily going with exactly what the analytics said he should. And I think that that's just a really good lesson for, how resulting can actually reduce your win probability because we're thinking ahead to what the reaction is going to be from people.
And I think it's so interesting because the coaches we've talked about are Pete Carroll, who had, I believe, won a Super Bowl at that time and had won a national championship at USC. We're talking about Belichick, one of the greats of all time. Nick Saban, another great. And then Doug Peterson, I would say, would be the only outlier of the four where at the time he didn't kind of have that reputation where he could get away with something that maybe others don't.
Right.
And
he had a GM and an owner that were really on board.
that's what I was just going to say. I was reading something recently about how the GM and the owner are very on board. And if you're not even a young coach, but a newer head coach, and you don't have the reputation of a Belichick or a Saban, and you maybe don't have a athletic director or a GM or an owner who's on board with doing things that are against the norm, then you've got to balance do I go for it on fourth down on my own 20 to try to win the game?
Right.
And do I then risk my job because I also have to want to go home and feed my wife, or do I just punt it and, hope for the best?
Yeah, and it's really interesting because when we think about this sort of change in attitudes about fourth down, the funny thing is it came from high school.
I know.
Right? Because this isn't like $1 million a year job for that, for that coach. I can't remember what his name is. Maybe you remember what his name is.
I know you're talking about it. The guy who goes for it every single time.
Literally didn't have a punter on his team. Right? Because he figured out, at least in high school. Now, obviously in the NFL, that's not true, right? You need a punter. But at least in high school, what he figured out is it's kind of always right to go for it on fourth down, and he did that and they ended up winning. But again, you're not talking about big career risk. Like, he's a high school coach. And so you can see that that's where it sort of bubbled up from, with someone who was sort of like, whatever, screw it. Like, what's the worst that's going to happen? I get fired. But, when you're talking about someone who's, a new coach, what's the worst that's going to happen? I'm going to get fired. Well, that's a really big deal, right? Even so, Pete Carroll didn't get fired after that happened. And we're still talking about it. But at least he didn't get fired.
If you enjoy this podcast, I also write a weekly newsletter sharing the best content I found in the last week that directly applies to coaches. Some of the best coaches in the world subscribe, and it's free. So go to coachingcoaches.substack.com or check out the link in the show notes to subscribe. Once again, that's coachingcoaches.substack.com. Let's get back to the episode. So I want to pivot now to kind of organizational and group decision making, putting Annie Duke in the seat of either being the GM of a professional franchise or the head coach of like a college team. And we're thinking about...
Oh, no, don't do that. You'll lose.
No pressure. Can't be worse than the Knicks. So you are trying to set up an organization where we have scouts and coaches who are bubbling up their opinions and ideas and are hired to make calls or predictions for a reason, and they're scouting players. What sort of things would you want to ensure are set up in the organization so that the best decision is the one that happens in the end?
Oh my gosh, where do we start? Yeah, so let me kind of start before I get into sort of like what the pieces of the decision might be. Let me just talk about sort of what the process for doing it is on a team that's going to really increase the quality of the decision that you make. So here's the thing. When we think about, a decision for example, to roster a player, or to recruit somebody, or to draft them. We know that whenever we, let's say we recruit a player onto a college team, that there's a bunch of different ways that could go, right? I mean, they could get injured literally, in training, right? And never even play a game. They could end up being the Heisman Trophy winner. Like, I mean, it's like a very wide range from like never even play a game to Heisman Trophy winner.
Yeah, it's not flip a coin and its head, tails are on its side.
And obviously there's some positions that are unlikely to win a Heisman. If you're the left tackle, I don't think you're going to get a Heisman. But, but that person could still be a superstar, end up in the NFL, right? So we can sort of think about what that range of things are that could happen. And some of how that, what happens in terms of how that player actually ends up performing is going to be due to what we do, right? Like, what are our trainers? What is our coaching? What is our mindset? What is the team culture? There's gonna be a whole bunch of stuff that we do have some control over, but a lot of it is just darn luck. Do they get hit by the wrong person at the wrong time when their leg is in the wrong position? Right. I mean, there's just a bunch of stuff that like we kind of don't have any, control over. Right. So when we think about the way that these decisions are going to turn out, there's kind of two influences that make it so that we can't perfectly predict the future. The first is what I just said, which is luck. Can't do anything about that. If that, if the ball's going to get intercepted 2% of the time, it's going to get intercepted 2% of the time. If you run that play 100 times and you don't have any control over whether it's going to get intercepted on that particular time. You just know it's going to happen 2% of the time, no control. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't have a sense of how much luck's influence there will be in the decision. You certainly want to have that kind of sense, but ultimately you don't have control over that. What you do have control over, though, is the quality of the information that's informing the decision. So that doesn't just include facts, like how fast does the player run? What was their record in high school, any of those things. I mean, those are certainly facts that you want to know. You certainly want to know things about what their personal habits are, how disciplined they are, so on and so forth. But there's also just perspectives. What are the perspectives of the scouts? What are the perspectives of different scouts? Because different scouts could view the same player and come up with very different ideas about, what their prediction for what that player's career is going to look like. The analysts may think very differently than the scouts do, and you want to know what the analysts are thinking, right? So and so forth. So there's all these people who are going to have different perspectives. So there's sort of the facts of the matter, and then also how are people sort of looking at those facts and thinking about what that means for what I would predict for this player in comparison to other players that we might be considering for the same position. Okay, so that's just sort of setting out what we're trying to do. So when we're making a decision about who we're going to bring on the team, essentially we're making a prediction about the future. We're just like, we'd like to have a crystal ball. We're trying to get as close to a crystal ball as possible to predict what the future might hold for us. The more perspectives that we can bring into that decision, generally, the better off we are. Now, it's good if those perspectives are informed, but I assume that the people who are on the team of coaches and scouts and so on and so forth are going to have informed perspectives. The problem is that when we make decisions and we're thinking, okay, two heads are better than one, so we'll get a bunch of people to talk about this decision. We have the sense that that's going to produce a higher quality decision. Turns out that it mostly doesn't. And the reason why it mostly doesn't is because we're discussing those decisions as a group, meaning we all come in a room and we all start talking about what our opinions are in the presence of other people. And that actually tends to not produce a better decision. It produces more confidence in the decision that you make, but the decision itself isn't better. And the reason for that is that when we actually discuss things in a group, what people's true perspectives are tend to get suppressed. And that's because, for example, you can imagine, like, if the head coach expresses an opinion, you think the lowly scout over here is going to really disagree with them strongly? It's hard for them to do that. That's kind of number one, is that when you express your opinion in a group setting, if someone has a different idea, you're forcing them to disagree with you because you've said what you think in front of them. The other thing is that when people are discussing in groups, they sort of feel, I think, intuitively like the goal is to agree with each other. We're supposed to reach some sort of agreement, and all end up walking out of here with the same view. So we're sort of pushing toward agreement. So once somebody starts to see that there's consensus forming in the room, they'll tend not to squeak too much, because we think this is what the goal is, for us all to end up in the same place. But that's not actually the goal of a meeting. A goal of having a bunch of people come in and give their perspectives is to inform everybody of the different ways that you can model the data that you have, the different ways that you can think about it and view it, and the different perspectives that you have. And then the person who ultimately would decide, like the GM, then is now the best informed that they can, and they can make the decision. And nobody in the room needs to agree with each other. I can have one perspective and think the person's going to be a dud, and you can have the perspective that you think they're going to be great. And as long as the GM hears both of our perspectives, they can now make a better informed decision. But the problems are coming from being in a group. So I'll give you a really simple demonstration of this, but there's lots and lots of science on this. It's a really elegant, little simple demonstration. So a couple of people at Harvard, Richard Zeckhauser and Dan Levy, did a study. And they had two sections of a lecture. Remember when you were in like big lectures, and they would, you'd be divided into sections. And in the first section, they had people answer questions, by raising their hands, which is basically what happens in a meeting. You're raising your hand in front of other people. And when that happened, you would get these like big super majorities that would form. And you could see why that is. Like, I'm not sure of my answer. And then I look around and Colby seems pretty smart. And so he raises his hand. And then I'm like, okay, I'll raise my hand. That must be the right answer. And all of a sudden you have all these people like raising their hands for a particular answer, and you get these big majorities. So that's what happened with one section. With the other section, they had people just answer with a clicker. So notice, like, if you're answering with a clicker, nobody else can see what your answer is anymore. Do you know what happened? All the super majorities broke up. All of a sudden, you can sort of think about it as, when you're answering with a clicker, you're actually finding out what people really think, as opposed to finding out what they'll say when they see what other people think. So when we're thinking about how do we make really good decisions and harness the power of the different perspectives we have from the scouts and the analysts and the coaches and so on and so forth, the idea is that we want to somehow answer with a clicker, because that's going to actually allow us to see into their brains in the best way and solve this problem of, like, we just sort of have limited information. And so the more perspectives that we can get on the information that we have, the better off we are. The more that we can tap the knowledge that other people have that we might not have, that might be a gap for us, the better off we're going to be. So this is like step one. When you're thinking about, like, do you want to recruit a particular player, and you're trying to elicit the opinions of the people who are, on the team, on the coaching staff, or the analysts or the scouts, make sure that they're giving them to you independently, number one, and that they don't know what your opinion is. So don't go and say, hey, Rob Smith looks really amazing to me. I think he's going to be a superstar. What do you think? There's literally no point in my asking now. But if I say, hey, here's all this information about Rob Smith, and here's how fast he runs a 440, and here's what his stats were in high school, and here's what his references say, and here's what his coaches say, here's what his academic record is. What do you think? Should we bring him on the team? I'm going to get a much better and purer look into what's living in your head than if I do it the other way. So we want to do that, and we want to make sure that we're doing that in a way that the team, that the coaching staff or the analysts, whoever, aren't infecting each other. So just ask everybody independently and have them email it to you.
Yeah, I almost feel like you have one person who collects all the thoughts beforehand and then almost redistributes it as a packet or something, so everyone can see.
Right. Yeah. And then everybody reads the packet before they come in. Guess what? Number one, everybody now sees the areas where there's agreement and sees the areas where there's some dispersion in terms of the way that people think, where there's divergence of opinion. That's really good. So number one, now you can go in the room and you can sort of flip the script on how meetings normally go. In meetings, most of the time is spent talking about areas that you agree. So he'll say something about Bob Smith or Rob Smith, I guess we were calling him. And then I'll say, I agree with Colby. Let me tell you why I agree with it. And there's a lot of sort of like what you call double clicking on points. Now we can go in and say, well, we all already know that Colby and Annie agree about all this stuff. But you know what? You really actually disagree about how injury prone he's going to be. Let's have a discussion about that. And now we can actually talk about why we disagree, not with the goal to get for me to convince you or you to convince me, but just with the goal for you to tell me what your rationale is for why you think they're going to be very injury prone. And for me to say what my rationale is as to why I don't think that. That's it. We don't have to agree with each other. We get to literally walk out of the room. Now, when I tell you my rationale, you may come to my side naturally, or I may move to your side. But if we don't, it's fine. Whoever's the decision maker just got to see both of our points of view, which is all you really care about. So that's number one, is that you can actually hone in on the things that matter. Because the things that matter is not so much the places you agree, but the places where there are differences of opinion. And then the second thing that comes from that that's really wonderful is it lets people see on the team that to be a good part of a team, a coaching staff or whatever, that it doesn't mean that being on the same page means agreeing. And it starts to let people know, hey, we all think different things. And isn't that great? Because our meetings are a lot better for it. And we're a lot more informed and we make better decisions because of it. And I think it's great that we all have different perspectives. Yay, us.
Makes me think a lot about Ray Dalio's, I forget what he calls it, radical transparency, or the best ideas rise to the top, and how you want that.
I don't take it quite as far as he does, because I think that it's a very particular mindset, and you end up, for what he's doing, it makes sense.
Correct.
Right. But there's a very particular mindset that is okay with people like rating you in real time in a meeting for the quality of your opinions.
Yes, that's not where I was going with it.
Yeah. But what I do like about it is that you do want to be able to expose the differences of opinion and have a real conversation where people are conveying the reasons why they believe what they do, so that the ultimate decision maker, which is, particularly like in a coaching staff, it's rarely by consensus, right? There's somebody who's the decision maker. And all the decision maker should care about is, I don't need everybody to agree with me. I don't need everybody to agree with each other. I need to be as informed as possible so that I can make the best decision.
That obviously takes a leader in the organization, whoever it is, to not penalize you when, if I give my opinion and I'm hired to give my opinion and I say Rob Smith is going to be a stud, you can't come back at me later on and say, what the hell were you saying? You essentially, to me, then have to address me at that time and say, Colby, I disagree with you and the thought process that you have of it. But once again, we're resulting if 10 years down the line, Robert Smith has been a complete waste for us and hasn't produced for us. And then you're criticizing me for it.
Yeah. So there's kind of two things there that I would say. Thing number one is that I don't need to say I disagree with you, because we already found that out. So there should be a facilitator who actually isn't, where I'm not saying to you, well, I think you're wrong ever, right? The person, when you're in the meeting, I already know, right? I say, hey, Colby, you think that Rob Smith is going to be a stud. Can you just give your rationale for that? And then you do. And then I say, oh, by the way, there's a couple other people in the room who think that as well. Do you have anything to add to what Colby said? Great. Full stop. There's no me saying, but you haven't thought about it this way, or you haven't thought about this data or whatever, because they're going to come around with me and they're going to say, Annie, you think they're going to be a dud. So can you tell me what's your rationale for that? Why do you think that? Oh, and by the way, Annie, Morgan over here also, it seems to be in your camp as well. Morgan, do you have anything to add to what Annie said? And then I can say, Colby, I'm a little confused. I would like you to clarify why this particular data point makes you feel this way, because I'm not sure I'm tracking and understanding. But once I get to the point where I understand why you came to the conclusion that you did, even if I don't agree, at the end of the discussion, then I get to say my piece. So that's kind of like, I think that's actually just kind of a really important point. There is no argument in the room. There's no me saying I disagree, and that's a stupid way to think about it. So that's kind of number one, because there is no stupid way to think about it. Number two is that if you're making the right kinds of forecasts, what you care about in terms of the decision makers on your team is not so much that you predicted that Rob Smith would be a stud and he turned out not to be, because that's just resulting, right? What we care about is across the set of people, that you made predictions about that generally you're pretty well calibrated, right? So, so you can think about it as like, for example, let's say that one of the things that I'm getting feedback on from my team is what's the probability that during the 4 years that they're here, if I'm a college, that they have an injury that takes them out for a season. I mean, I'm just making this up, right? But let's do that. So everybody just writes that probability down, right? And you let's say that you did that for every single player that you were thinking about recruiting. Well, now I get a lot of data from Colby. And this is actually really good because now I can say, Colby, you're kind of off on your injury predictions here. You seem to be pretty dark. You're overestimating the chances that our running backs are going to have a season-ending injury. But now I can give you that feedback, right? Now, if you don't take the feedback and you don't adjust, I should probably fire you. But if you do take the feedback, then you have a chance now to adjust and calibrate. And the whole point is that this is all, you're trying to create these really good feedback loops where what I can do is I can take someone on the team and not worry so much, did you predict that Rob Smith was going to be a stud or not? Because we don't really know much about the quality of your ability to predict off of one person. But if I can get you to predict across like a whole bunch of different things, then now everybody's better off. You're thinking more clearly about what are the things that are going to help you to decide, because that would be important to know, right? And I now have a way to start giving you feedback really, really quickly that allows you to start being better in terms of the way that you think about those decisions.
So, something you and I have said in this conversation is we've each called Robert Smith, who he's got to have a great career based on what we've said about him so far. But we've each called him a star, a stud, a superstar. When we're having the conversation about Rob Smith, let's say he's a running back, how should we be verbalizing what we think about him in a precise way? So we are talking on the same page. Because in your book, you've got some fascinating data on how stud or superstar or whatever other vague term we use can be really misconstrued over time.
I actually go through and I talk about the importance of speaking with precision. So you can see that what I'm talking about a lot is uncovering this dispersion of opinion, right? Like this is what we want to do. We want to find out that Colby and Annie don't agree with each other because that's where all the good stuff is. That's where we really improve our decision making, by finding that out. But there's like other subtle ways besides like speaking in a meeting and giving your opinion first and this kind of stuff, where we can hide the fact that we disagree. And one of those places is by using language that's imprecise. So the question is, for example, for me to use the term superstar or stud, what do I think that means, right? First of all, what do I think the probability is that happens? I may think that if there's a 35% chance that they become a superstar, that's enough for me. But you may think it needs to be a 65% chance for it to be like a thing that you would want to do. And the other thing is, what does superstar mean? Right? Maybe we don't know. I should actually write that down. Like if it's a running back, how many yards do I think they're going to gain during their college career? Because I may think superstar is something really different than you do. Right? If I think about how many interceptions is a cornerback going to make? Right? In order for me to call them a superstar, we may have very different ideas about this. So I may say, I think this person's going to be a superstar cornerback. And you could say, I think that they're going to be a superstar cornerback. And we may actually be disagreeing with each other without knowing it, because we may have a very different idea of what the definition of superstar is. So there was a really wonderful survey done by Michael Mauboussin and Andrew Mauboussin. And it was actually inspired by some work of Phil Tetlock. What they did basically was they took a whole bunch of words that mean a probability. So like, for example, never is a probability somewhere close to zero. Always is a probability. For me, it means 100%, but somewhere close to 100%. But then you also have all sorts of stuff in between. You have slam dunk, you've got like real possibility, you've got maybe, people say probably, likely, all of these words where we're implying that something's going to happen with some likelihood, but we're not saying specifically what it is. And basically what they did was they had people answer in the same way that I just said, independently. For this list, if it's about 20 words and it's in my book, you can go actually do this with your staff in my book. and have you write down, okay, for me to say the word real possibility, how often do I think that that would have to occur? Like if I were thinking about how many times out of 100 would that happen? And then I can put down whatever that percentage is. And then I have Colby do it, right? And then we can compare and we can say, when we say real possibility, do we mean the same thing? So they did this survey and it's astonishing. First of all, people don't agree on what always and never means. So they give themselves, some people give themselves like 5% wiggle room. Other people say it means 100 and 0. But when you get into these sort of more middle terms, like real possibility, the range is between 20% of the time and 80% of the time. Think about that. So if you say, I think there's a real possibility that this person is going to be a superstar, let's assume we've agreed on what superstar means. But that's no small task. And you say, I think there's a real possibility. So I agree. I think there's a real possibility he'll be a superstar too. You might mean 80% and I might mean 20%. So we should have been having a conversation about it. But because we use these kind of mushy terms, we never found it out. So the more that you can speak with precision, the more that you can say, look, I want you to actually forecast how many yards do you think this running back is going to gain in their college career? And what's kind of the lower bound and what's the upper bound? What's the smallest number and what's the biggest number that you think, Colby? And then you can elicit that opinion from me as well. Independently, we can now look and say, oh, we have a really big disagreement. Colby thinks that the player is going to be much more productive than Annie does. Let's talk about it. Why do we have that difference of opinion? Right? If we forecast, what are the chances that they're going to have a season-ending injury during the 4 years that they're with us, we don't want to say something like, well, I think there's a real possibility of that happening. You want to say, you think it's going to happen 40% of the time. And then when we do that as part of the decision process, our decisions get better. But the other thing that happens is that I have a way to help you become a better decision maker because now these things actually occur in the real world. And instead of resulting, I can now look across all of these things that you've sort of forecast across all of the players that we've recruited. You can do this actually for individual games as well. Everybody can predict how many yards are we going to gain? How many yards are they going to gain? And you keep sort of iterating this, and then you can start to see, like, how good am I actually forecasting this stuff? Because that's all a decision is how good are we at predicting the future?
And we go from saying Robert Smith is going to be a star, we should recruit him, to saying I think there's a 75% chance he starts for us for 3 years and a 25% chance he doesn't, and I think we should go, do XYZ and recruit him because of that.
Exactly. And you can see how that's really helpful for like individual games as well, right? The more that we can actually think about that, when you're thinking about like, what schemes do we want to be running here? Right? You can actually think, if we run this scheme, what do we think the chances are that we win? If we run this scheme, what do we think the chances are that we win? What kind of, let's all predict, let's write down what look is the other team going to give us? Right? We can write down what the probability, we know what they have sort of in their toolkit, right? Like, what do we think the probability is of these things? We just do things like, how many yards do we think we're going to gain running? How many yards do we think that we're going to gain passing? How many times do we think we're going to have to punt? Right? And you can actually just create like a checklist of stuff that you forecast for each game. That's going to really improve your decisions because, first of all, you're going to start to see pretty quickly how calibrated you are. Not off one game, but particularly like if you're a basketball coach, think about how many of those forecasts you can now make during a season. And you can start to sort of see, like, how good are we at predicting how many points we're going to score? How good are we at predicting these things? Because that really matters for what your strategy is when you go in. The better that you can predict the future, given whatever decisions, the better you're going to be better off. And there's no doubt about that. So start learning how to predict the future and not just do it by, we lost the game, we must have made bad decisions.
So Annie, before we get to the end of episode questions, where can people we'll link the book in the show notes on Amazon, I'm sure, but where can people either reach out to you, follow you, the newsletter?
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So basically all things Annie Duke are at annieduke.com.
Hard to remember.
I know. There's a contact form there, and I really do try to I'm not perfect at it, but I probably get to over, somewhere around 90% of the people who reach out to me, I do actually respond to. Not because I'm trying to not respond to the other 10%. It's just, stuff gets buried in email. Sometimes you think, oh, I'm going to respond to them tomorrow, and then you forget. So I really love hearing from readers. I would say that the reason why I wrote How to Decide was because of conversations with readers of the other book. So I really appreciate it. It actually helps me learn to hear from people. You can follow me on Twitter also at Annie Duke. I'm pretty active over there. And then I do have a newsletter. It's been spotty because I've been in the process of writing this book, but I'm going to get back to it. You can see archives on it there, and you can sign up for the newsletter at annieduke.com as well. And then the last thing is I would love if people would go explore the Alliance for Decision Education. That's a nonprofit that I co-founded that's trying to bring some of these concepts like that we talked about today into K through 12 education. So we really believe, to have a well-functioning society and for people to live happy lives, they need to learn how to make great decisions. And we're really falling short of teaching kids to do that in K through 12 education, spending a lot of time teaching trigonometry, which I'm not sure why, and less time teaching decision making and sort of how to think about the way, in the way that we're talking about, like probabilistically, and think about your own habits and just generally what makes a decision good, and how do you think about how you interact with the world in that way and learn from experience. So trying to get that to be a movement into K through 12 to start increasing that.
That's awesome. We'll link that in the show notes. I know I would have much rather learned about that than trigonometry in high school.
Yeah,
So,
which I'm sure you've used so much. You've been raising a lot of barns recently, no doubt.
some end of episode questions for you. So, what's one book you think every coach should read? Obviously, after yours.
A book that every coach should read. Oh, that's an easy one, actually. The Success Equation by Michael Mauboussin. It's an incredible book that talks about the influence of luck and skill. There's he actually leans very heavily on sports and thinking about what the relationship between, skill and luck is in outcomes in sports. But I think if there was one, I would actually say you should read The Success Equation long before you should read my book. If you're a coach, I think it would be life-changing for any coach.
High praise. What's one person you'd want to hear as a guest on this podcast?
Well, you should get Michael Mauboussin on. Obviously, he wrote The Success Equation.
Easy answer.
Yes.
We'll work on that then. So, what's one area you're looking to improve in over the next year?
So I would say, actually, that's really interesting. I think probably for me, it's just negative self-talk. I'm really bad with that. So I would like over the next year to be kinder to myself.
Yeah, I think that's you talked a lot, and for those listening, I mean, there's so much of both of her books today that we have not talked about, and one of the things I love was the idea that we need to be more compassionate to ourselves with decision making, which is something you don't think about. At least I don't think about compassionate decision making. So I think that's a great goal to work on for the next year. What's popular advice you hear people say you think is wrong?
You make your own luck.
Why?
Because you don't make your own luck. You make decisions that change what the influence of luck is going to be. In other words, I can make a decision where I'm going to have a great outcome 60% of the time and a bad one 40% of the time. Or I might have a different option that I could choose where I'm going to have a great outcome 80% of the time and a great outcome 20% of the time. So obviously I would prefer to make the latter decision. I'm going to get a good outcome more of the time, but that's making a decision. That's not making my own luck. So, and I think it's actually a really bad, it sounds trivial, but it's not. Because if we start thinking that somehow like luck intervening in a negative way is your own fault, that doesn't make any sense. And I think that it's going to really distort your decision making to give you an idea that you have more control over outcomes than you actually do. And one of the things in order to make great decisions is to realize there's only so much control you have. And the thing you have control over is which option do you choose, which is going to be informed by what do you know? What are the perspectives that you've tapped into? Because higher quality decisions are going to reduce the chances that bad things happen to you. But I can make the best decision in the world, like, Pete Carroll, and 2% of the time that was going to be a disaster. And you know what? It happened because you don't control the luck element. You control the quality of your decisions and you have some control over what you know. So focus on that stuff.
Well, the next question is, what advice do you have for young coaches who are listening? But I think that's good
it.
advice right there.
Go.
Yeah, there we go.
That's
2 for 1.
Yeah.
So last but not least, what's the darkest moment you experienced professionally and how did you overcome it?
Oh, I mean, it was definitely when I was so sick. And what's interesting, I mean, obviously I wasn't planning to drop out of graduate school. So,
yeah.
And I would say that what happened with that was that, so, I ended up playing poker and then I was kind of ashamed, I was ashamed that I didn't go and become an academic. And I thought that I had really disappointed my mentors. And that was kind of a darkness that I carried with me for, like 18 years, where I really thought I had disappointed, in particular, Lila and Henry Gleitman, who were my advisors at Penn. And I just really kind of like, even though I was really successful in poker, sort of deep down inside, I felt like I was a failure because I hadn't followed through on becoming a professor. And interestingly enough, like one of the best things that ever happened in my life was I ran into Lila randomly in a waiting room of an orthopedic office, Rothman Institute, which I'm sure a lot of coaches are familiar with in the Philadelphia area. And I just saw her. She had hurt her hip and I had hurt my shoulder and I hadn't seen her in obviously a very long time. And I went over and sat next to her and I was very afraid because I was really carrying around like this real, like I disappointed her and I failed and whatever. But I got up the courage and I went over and saw her. And we've seen each other every 2 weeks since then. She just like, there was no failure. She was like, I'm so proud of you. I wish I had had that conversation earlier, but that's what actually allowed me to sort of let go of that feeling of shame. So there you go.
That's great. I appreciate you sharing with us. Well, Annie, thank you so much. You've been listening to the Coaching Coaches Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and receive our world-class newsletter in your inbox every Sunday. You can access both of those at coachingcoaches.co. Once again, that's coachingcoaches.co.